been learning about value investing, finance, just regular investment for a while now, but you don't know where to go next. You're getting confused about the vast amount of information on the internet. You don't want to waste your time on crap information. You want good information and reliable information. In this series of videos on value investing and finance education, you will find those answers to those questions and much more. My name is Jason Rivera. Welcome to Value Investing and Finance Education. Hey, Jason here. Today I want to talk to you about how I deal with complexity in investing. And frankly, why it's important to deal with that complexity. So first off, I need to let you know this video is available as a podcast audio anywhere in the world for free on all major podcasting platforms, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Anchor, and others in the I Love Value Investing podcast. I Love Value Investing podcast, brand new podcast. If you didn't see the blog post about this, we got a brand new podcast. We're bringing our other videos. We're turning them into other podcast episodes that fit outside of the Value Investing in Your Car episode series. You can listen to this video and others as podcasts anywhere in the world for free. I Love Value Investing podcast. Okay, so what we do as value investors, investment analysts, business analysts, pretty complex, right? Essentially what we're trying to do is figure out if this investment is a good investment, is this investment a terrible investment and we should stay away from it, or is this investment the best investment at this point in time with the knowledge we have. And we only get to do that as outside shareholders reading financial statements. Sometimes an annual report. For me, because I focus on smaller companies, typically 50 to 100 pages for an annual report. For bigger companies, somewhere between 100 and 200 pages typically. The longest one I've seen, I think it was a Thai company that was like 374 pages long. Plus you have the most recent quarterly report, most recent annual reports, or most recent proxy reports. And then typically what I do is I go back and read at least 5 years of annual reports as well, on top of the most recent one. So we're talking, even for smaller companies, which is again what mostly what I focus on, probably between about 300 and 600 pages worth of information, very technical and legalized, very technical and legal wording specific documentation. So how do I wade through all of this information? The way I view investing, or considering investing, when I'm researching an investment, the way I consider it as I go into it is I'm looking for things to disqualify the company. Why do I do that? The reason I look for disqualification factors first, after the preliminary analysis, this is after the preliminary analysis shows that it might be a decent investment. So I do the preliminary analysis, then I get into the financial statements. I look for disqualifying information at the preliminary analysis stage that will get rid of this investment faster. And then at the second stage, I look for further, if it passes the first stage and looks like a decent investment or a decent potential investment, I look for further disqualification information. The reason I do this is because for me, because my criteria is so strict, it's far easier to disqualify an investment than it is to find a potentially good investment and qualify it. The reason being is because my criteria is so strict that barring some kind of NCAV situation, some kind of special situation, the criteria, I pretty much stick by the criteria I use. Other than those kind of situations, almost 100% of the time. I vary, off the top of my head, I can't think of one instance where I've kind of gone away from that. And it's worked. I've gone away from it and it hasn't worked. But I can't think, especially earlier in my investing career, I can't think of an instance where I went away from my criteria again, other than an NCAP situation, other than a special situation, and it worked. The other reason I'm looking to disqualify companies instead of qualifying them is because I find it easier, at least for the way my mind works, I find it easier to discard things, easier to find red flags, because I go into any investment with an open but skeptical mindset. I go into any investment thinking, if it passes the preliminary analysis stage, I go in thinking this could be a potentially great investment. But then I start reading the financials and I go in with that open mindset, but I go in looking to disqualify. So I'm looking for negative things, red flags, management issues, things in the footnotes or the financial statements I don't like for example, in the proxy reports, super complex compensation packages, egregious overpayments of management, especially compared to the size of the company. For example, years ago, I was researching a company that their market cap, I think, was around $4.5 million. So a tiny company. And they paid out about a quarter of that to just the 7 executives in the company, which is just absolutely, I'm all for people getting rich because I'm working towards that, all people making a ton of money, as much money as they want. But when it comes at the expenses of shareholders, that's when I have a problem with it. So those are the kind of things I look for. So how do I specifically deal with the complexity, though? Because you still have to, even going through the financial statements, 300 to 600 pages worth of information. If you go back 10 years, you're talking about double that worth of information. So 600 to 1,200 pages worth of documents, potentially hundreds of hours of research. What do I specifically do to deal with the complexity? To deal with a great part of that, I've regimented my process a lot since when I first started. I do a very strict preliminary analysis screen with my checklist. I then read the financial statements, and if I see some minor, what I would term as minor red flags, things as me not necessarily agreeing with company decisions, management, poor usage of capital, stuff like that, I can deal with a few of those. But if I get even one major red flag, usually, again, barring some kind of unforeseen circumstance, I discard the company like that. Because my number one rule in investing is if I can't trust management to do what's in the best interest of all shareholders, I discard the investment no matter what. The reason being is because if I can't trust managers, why should I put my money essentially in their hands as a shareholder, which is what you're doing. If you're owning shares in the company, you're essentially putting your capital into management's hands to grow. That's essentially what you're doing. So if I can't trust them, why would I invest any money in them? Unless I'm trying to do an activist situation, which I'm not really interested in at this point. So what I look for on the first kind of reading of the, let's say, the annual report, first reading of the annual report, I take, typically if it's 100 pages, I take about 20 or 30 pages worth of notes in my notes. Actually, let me go back. So that's my first set of notes, my reading of the most recent annual, most recent quarterly, and most recent proxy. Typically, I take about 20 or 30 pages of notes total for all three of those documents. Again, I focus on small companies, so this might be different if you focus on bigger companies. Most of the notes are things like general company information, information on properties, information on the operations, how they've grown over time, how their plans have worked over time, stuff like that. The main things I look for, though, major red flags. If they're positives, if there are major positives, that's great. But I look for major red flags first. Again, so I can disqualify the company faster. Major red flags for me are mainly management issues, or management trustability issues is a better way to put it. So these go things like lawsuits against the executives, potential embezzlements, misuse of company capital, for one of the insurance companies I looked at a while ago, this is probably 3-4 years ago now, they didn't even use some of the common insurance industry terms like combined ratio. If I remember right, combined ratio wasn't even mentioned in their entire report. And that is, if you understand insurance companies, that is one of the most important numbers to talk about. That wasn't even mentioned in the report. That is a massive red flag. For example, that same company, for insurance companies, the what is it called? The cumulative redundancy or cumulative deficit chart. It's this weird, super complex looking kind of triangular chart that shows the cumulative redundancy and cumulative deficit the company has earned over, I think, 10-year period. Every single insurance company report has one, except for this company. Again, another major red flag for that same company. That's another example. Misuse of company capital. One example is that I've come across is Wendy's executives using the company's private plane they weren't supposed to go on non-business trips, but they could use the plane for personal use because it wasn't outright barred. That's, in my opinion, was a minor thing, but I didn't necessarily like, combined with some of the other stuff, like Wendy's also paid for this billionaire, I think he was the chairman of the company at the time, paid for his security. Again, it was only a couple $100,000. It wasn't a major issue in terms of the grand scheme of things, but it made me not trust that they have all shareholders' best interests at heart. Those are some specific examples of things I look for to deal with the complexity. The way I deal with pretty much everything is I try to make things as simple as possible. I do that. I'm very good at synthesizing information. I don't really know why. I don't know if it's how my mind's set up. If I train myself to do this, I don't really know why. But I'm very good at synthesizing information. So typically, when I look at a financial report or financial statements, I look for major red flags, major points of interest I want to talk about, and that's it. And usually for the major points of interest, if there's one major red flag, typically I step away from the investment no matter what. If there's some minor ones, and again, there's always risks. It doesn't matter how confident you are in the investment, there's always risk. So risks and red flags are two different things to me. In terms of the positive things, I look for probably around 3 things to typically talk about. If I'm going to write an article, let's say a 20, 30, 40 page article about them, like I used to, I look for 2 or 3 major things to talk about in the entire article. And that's kind of what I focus on for my investment thesis. Again, 2 or 3 things, try to keep things as simple as possible. And typically 2 or 3 things are what makes up the major difference for a company. For example, if it has competitive advantages and its competitors don't, that's one major thing that it has in its advantage that obviously other companies don't. If it has patents that another company in the industry doesn't have, that's a major advantage. If it's in an industry that's booming and is expected to boom for the next 20 years, that's a major advantage. if it's in a dying industry, like retail, that is a major disadvantage, major kind of story point to look for. On top of this, so let's add another layer of complexity to this. So that's how I deal with an individual company. Let's say years ago I researched, I think it was 4 or 5 fast food companies, public companies. So what I do if a company's in a industry, a public company industry, I research its closest 3-4 competitors as well. So and by research I mean research on Google, and also reading their most recent financial statements at the very least. Sometimes I'll go back further, but that also helps. It's an enormous amount of work, but it also, while it adds complexity, it also lets me simplify things as well, because then I can put what I do is I put their specific ratios and metrics, for example, the ROIC or free cash flow to sales metrics from each of those companies into a chart, so I can see where things kind of stand. I'm a very visual person, so I put things in charts, and writing things down and rereading it on my computer helps me deal with complexity as well, because it helps me, again, process the information faster. I'm not really sure. But those are some very specific ways that I deal with complexity. The way I like to think about what I do when I read a financial statement. Annual 10K or 10K, 10Q proxy reports is 99% of the information, probably, that's probably no exaggeration, probably 90% of the information is in every single annual report you'll ever read, for example, is very similar. The risk factors are very similar across the board. Here's another tip. If you see a risk factor that you've never seen before, that's probably a red flag. Unless you're just starting out, that's probably a red flag, because most of the risk factors, the economy could crash at any time, our industry is competitive, and we're going to have a hard time competing with people. They're very typically similar. They're written, it sounds like they're written by lawyers. And if you find something that is a major risk factor that you don't expect or that you've never seen before, you need to read that very carefully. Because while I still read every single word in a financial report, there are areas you can go a little bit faster over, like the risk factors. If you are familiar with the company, they talk like 2 or 3 times in a annual report, for example, what the company does, its general kind of overview and its industry overview. They'll go over that 2 or 3 times in different sections. The footnotes are typically, depending on the company and its size and its industry, are very similar. Footnotes are extremely important as well. I spend a lot of my time in the footnotes making sure I understand everything properly, because that's where, to me, the most important information is in the footnotes. All the other stuff is important to a degree, but the footnotes are ultra important. So there's another tip. Focus on the footnotes. If you absolutely can't read every single word, which I highly recommend you do, at least focus on the footnotes, because that's where the most important information is, at least in my opinion. So what I do is I go through this, let's say it's a 100-page document that I'm reading, and a report, for example. 90 to 99% of the information to me is useless, because if it's a company, I don't generally care about stories. When I'm doing an investment thesis article, I don't care about what the company's social responsibility is, or what the social responsibility statement or whatever it is. Typically, I don't care about that, because typically it's just them talking about how great they are and how much they do for the community, which is, I mean, it's great. I'm all for charity, all for that kind of stuff, but it's not important for the investment thesis. The financial statements, if you've already done a preliminary analysis of the company, you should have already seen the financial statements. Going back over time, or the most recent financial statements you should have seen going back over time, it's interesting to see those. But typically, again, I look for 2 or 3 important things after I figure out that there's no major red flags. If there's a major red flag, it's gone. If there's some minor red flags, I can deal with one or two, maybe three. If they're minor, anything over that, the company's gone. And probably only 1 to 9% of the information in an annual report, proxy report, quarterly report is actually super important information to the investment thesis I'm building, to the actual investment itself, and frankly for most investors as well. Because again, a lot of the financial reports are very repetitive to a degree, especially if you're looking in the same industry. They're very repetitive. Same things over and over again, just in slightly different wording and different stories and stuff like that. But those are some of the major ways I deal with complexity. I look to simplify things as much as possible. I look for major red flags to disqualify the company. I look for 2 or 3 important things like competitive advantages, higher ROICs than industry, patents, hidden assets, like net operating loss carry forward, stuff like that. But most of the time I'm looking to disqualify the company and find that probably 90 to 99% of the information in every financial statement is useless in terms of the overall investment thesis and decision. So that is how I deal with complexity. Boiling things down from, if you're analyzing competitors, going back over 10 years of financial statements, hundreds, thousands of pages worth of financial docs, that is how I boil down my thought process. And I learned this specifically in terms of writing things down. I learned this when I was at the investment newsletter years ago, is when you write things down, even if it's on a computer, like what I do, even if it's not handwritten, it helps you remember things more, and it helps you spot flaws in your logic and your, in this case, investment thesis easier as well. And if you handwrite things, because you have to go slower, that will even increase your memory more. So because you have to slow down and kind of think about what you're doing. So super interesting stuff that I found out when I was at the investment newsletter that helps me deal with a lot of the complexity. Outlines, major points of interest, major points of potential risks. Those are how I deal with more complexity. Things like ROIC, competitive advantages on the positive side, major red flags, management trustability issues on the negative side. Try to get as simple as possible and focus on the super important things, not the risk factors. Like, this industry is super competitive and I can actually almost say it verbatim. I've read it so many times. Our industry is very competitive. We are in an industry with bigger, more well-funded competitors or competition, and they may have an advantage over us. That is one of the major risk factors that you will see in almost every single financial statement ever. So a lot of it, again, is repetitive once you read a certain amount of financial statements and reports. Excuse me. So it helps. Another thing that deals with complexity is reading more and more financial statements constantly. If you read one about one company in the industry, read about the 10 other companies in the industry if they're public. Read their financial reports, the annual, at least their most recent annual, probably the proxy as well. That will give you an enormous amount of information, and it'll help you spot trends in the industry, help you spot potential competitive advantages. For example, if the industry average ROIC is about 10%, but the company you're looking at has 17% consistent ROIC, it may have some kind of competitive advantages. And you can do that by reading the industry competitors' financial reports, and also putting that information in a spreadsheet like I do as well. So hope this helps. If you have any questions about dealing with complexity when investing, let me know, because what all of us try to do is make this as easy and as simple as possible, so we're dealing with sometimes multi-billion-dollar companies, and we as outside investors only have limited information, so we have to figure out what information is important, what information is not important. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Make sure to check out the I Love Value Investing podcast, which this video will be a part of. And you can listen to that podcast anywhere in the world for free on all major podcasting platforms. Until next time, I hope this helps. Thanks a lot. Talk soon.